Good evening, Masterclassers. This is YouTube Masterclass. Uh, it's Coursera class. We run Coursera. We teach to USC, Harvard, and Calarts, whereas you can gain credit through this class by watching all of them. And there was no midterm yet so far, so you've got to take the final to get credits for this class and get it graded. Although really, I expect you all to get an A that have even joined this class, and I do have a few people with me. I know we've got more joining later. One thing about Masterclass that's remote in Coursera is that there's no real bankable time limit to when you have to take the courses, just to prove them that you took all the courses that were issued to the course. That I keep track of that as a Coursera professor too is pretty easy because it all files under my videos, and I have a way to go back to which class is the one I'm looking for, and then to see what the final was, and then to see if anyone brings it to me. But Coursera has said we're checking out, we're fine. They just got to see, to get the units, they absolutely have to see the bar go all the way across. And I know these classes can get boring. I mean, heck, I chose kind of a boring topic this year, and there's 6 classes left, or 5 classes left, 6, and it's like we've got to talk about D.W.Griffith, and who not very many people have even heard that name. You take it for granted being a film student or being a film expert somewhere that we all know who D.W.Griffith is, and we think about his story sometimes when it becomes relevant in film history. There's lots of controversial moments in film history that are as controversial even as the Klansmen coming to reenact Birth of a Nation when it first came out. I mean, that's a pretty bad one, but just let me give you another bad one and kind of keep it quick. But there's this one in Italy where all these Italian directors were playing on the idea of building up to the most realistic images they could find, but then a lot of them were teasing that. Like Fellini and Pasolini kind of teased that idea of realism and just said, well, reality is so wild and expressionistic anyway, we're just going to capture the wild and expressionist things we see and do it that way. And so Pasolini is very poetic, very artistic, but ends his career with the most controversial film ever made. I actually had to get rid of my copy of it, and I think I've showed it to you on this masterclass, so it's a good thing it's gone. I can't really tell you where it went because I don't think it was exactly a legal copy, so I got rid of it, so it's no longer in my possession. I'm not saying that I illegally owned it. I didn't know, because I got it off of Amazon, that it was an illegal copy. And I'm not saying not to go to Amazon to get your copies, because it was one of those discs that lapsed in copyright at a certain time, and then it was time to get rid of it at that point, which I had advice to get rid of it before. And the point I'm making is it's such a rare film that they've taken it and offered many other versions of it, and this is where the studios get the versions of it. These underground clubs get the version of it, and then they start hacking it into these really scary cuts. Now, Birth of a Nation's different. This is Intolerance High. It's Intolerance Wave, everyone. No, but Birth of a Nation's different, though, because there were cuts added, and there were edits added, and there were edits taken away all throughout the film that were seeming like if you had ever seen that film as in the 80s, before the internet was predominant and before YouTube got the 4K version, which is nice. I've seen most of it. I let it run one night in here, and it was just beautiful. But the movie is catastrophic, and it's controversial, and maybe not worth its own screening if it's going to cause an uprising. But intentionally interesting is the uprising theory of film, because the uprising usually says that it's something that could be done after the film, like in which the film is. But this isn't really self-reflexive. This is more like copycat crimes. We've heard that whole issue of copycat crimes, and like how someone sees a film on screen and then they react by doing what's on screen. And there's kind of a scene to that in like this Don Quixote book by Cervantes, where they think it's the puppet show that's going to attack them, and so they attack it back. I mean, it's like a copycat threat. Now, I don't hold this to always be true, because although art imitates life and life imitates art, I often have to stop my class and wonder, have all artworks been repeated after they've been seen? I mean, like, you would say yes if you saw a few of them, if you saw a handful like Vertigo, the movie, well, that as unplausible as that seems, it could have happened, you know, and you're like, whoa, I'm getting backwards and forwards at the same time, whoa, you know, that could be a real way that people see it. It's documented scientifically that when people have vertigo, there's attraction and repulsion within the same frame. And you could see how a story like that could happen because they rely on these like trick metaphysics that this woman's like a ghost or she's been possessed by Carlotta, this Kim Novak, and Jimmy Stewart's like cruising all over town to like spy on her to see if she's doing these things that he's accused her of, and she's too ghost-like to question. And in a movie like that, she was performing within the performance, performing to be the chick that was possessed by Carlotta, not the real chick that was said she was possessed by Carlotta, but playing that girl. And there's all of these role swaps in Hitchcock, you see. Now, that's sophisticated. Griffith's working with some primitive works in Birth of a Nation because we know that one of the characters was playing 12 different cast members. And he was playing like a kid and like a banjo expert. I'm telling you, some of the scenes from Birth of a Nation that I've seen edited out or put back in, I don't know which version to trust, so I trust the Kino video version of it is what I have down there, I think. Let me check on that, folks. Let's bring it up here. Why not? Why not? Bring the Birth of the Nation to center. We're talking about this in their intolerance a lot because we're trying to get down. We talked about the Griffith style, how it is kind of this like observed look at the way images are captured in sequential order to then be edited, to then tell a story, to then use the editing with images with story that's actually developing the language of cinema at this point, because at this point not many of these films have been seen. And Birth of a Nation is a real attention grabber, controversial wise even. And if you were really upset about that, you could have given Intolerance a chance and seen that he was all hoots and hollers about going even a different way than Birth, but he doesn't come out and say that what he has done is racist, because at his day and age, the word racist was like very rarely used, and people did use it as kind of an insult. You know, we live in a society where people insult people with that term, and that term is kind of an insult, but not to the person you're telling it to, really, because they don't really care if they're racist or not. Why would you care? And pretty much that attitude is like where we are now. It's like, well, someone could be racist, but he's not going to get called out for it, because that could be either his character flaw or just one of his things, you know. And then they're going to sit here and say I'm defending one group over the other, and I'm not. Because, like, let's face it, even in the Civil War, there were issues beyond, like, what they're showing in the movie, beyond slavery. And I understand that there's the whole Ken Burns thing, that slavery in the Civil War was what caused it all. But really, it wasn't necessarily just that. It was that when the North was industrializing, they wanted the Southern money for one reason, and so they were going to go to the South to abolish slavery so that they'd have to convert to factory technology, and then everyone could be separate but equal again and just segregated. Because a lot of the times in the South, and even a couple places in the North, I'm not sure, but had segregation after the Civil War, that led up to the 1940s, even in the Harlem Renaissance, before that was even disbanded. And there still kind of is that. And I'm like, well, that's not the point, because if slavery was the only thing on everybody's mind, then don't you think the Southerners would have hid the slaves before they were manically called out to fight? Because I don't know why they wouldn't hide the slaves. They didn't want their slaves dead. They didn't want to come home and find a pile of slave bodies. That's how they were escaping. But they had to leave to fight the war and leave the women and children to tend to things. And really, for like an image of a South that's completely wasteland and Gone with the Wind and in Birth of a Nation, how the Atlanta's destroyed, everything's destroyed in the South, and it ain't what it used to be. Some of that nostalgia is used on by the Civil War epic from cinema history. Like, they're always talking about how when it's that whole idea of like, when we get home, we're going to have a cup of tea a piece of toast, go to bed, then get up, get on her horse, mount it back to the battlefield, and we're going. I mean, this is even in the Griffith book about how Griffith's dad was telling him that like his life was in these kind of like obsolete seeming battles that were going on in the Civil War, like how he would, from the Confederate angle, even though Griffith is somewhat of the North, and we don't know if Griffith is still got Thomas Edison on the mind or is still scared of Thomas Edison, but something tells me he was developing this movie when he was still with Thomas Edison, and Thomas Edison wanted it to go the northern way. And he wanted it to break even, D.W.Griffith, between the South and the North. And does he do that in this? Well, it seems like there were 50 scenes regarding the state of the North and 50 scenes regarding the state of the South, and all of them could have gone with either. And I'm saying that's a little too intrinsic of a number because it's not exactly that. It's more like there's 365 shots, rarely, if you see the whole thing and count all the shots. There may even be 1,000 if you count the exterior shots that are like scenes. That are, you know, the establishing shot counts, the shot reverse shot counts, the jump cut, there's rarely any of those. The ellipsis fade is like the end of a shot. They do that practice where they put that on a telecine, and a telecine is like this box that you put the editing clips through. You put it through one reel and one reel, and it's got the two reel thing, and they meet in the middle, and one's looping onto the right. It loops from left to right. It's like the way you read. And then it goes through this little machine, and you can see the movie on the telecine, and that's how you know where to make a slice on the film. The film can be very tough to slice. That's why most of us don't use that method anymore in digital filmmaking. In digital filmmaking, it's a different idea, wherein your computer has to be working full on, and then you go in and you manipulate the pieces just like they're on film. There's like a strip of film, and like you can manipulate the pieces easier that way because you can cut and trim a section here and put it back, and if you need to put it back, you can. It's not like where you make the ultimate edit is going to be that scene and that's the marker, but that's how down to the wire they had to be, even in those types of films they threw away, like at Tin Pan Alley. And I always bring Tin Pan Alley and vaudeville up, and that's just because those were the venues that the film was modeling itself after for some time. And it's strange that the Native Americans don't really come up in Birth of a Nation. I mean, maybe he was saying they were already like taken out of market by the Old West, and that like the Old West was supposed to keep lasting, but that like by the time they closed the frontier, it was 1895 when the frontier closed at the end of the Civil War. And the aftermath years saw the Mexican-American War. Nobody really talked much about that, but the aftermath of Birth of a Nation was intolerance. A man begging us to all take him back and pay for all of his movies from now on because he's almost got contracts with everybody. And now that he's got contracts with everybody, he's got movies to make, and Lillian Gish has him under contracts. And there ain't no way she's going to let him out of another contract and let him do what he wants. But that she gets a sentimental role in this for just a woman rocking a cradle that keeps track of how long time takes. I like that she has a small role in Intolerance, but it's still the big role of kind of the meta-narrator. Now, the meta-narrator is a term that like goes along with narrator. Narrator is one that makes it obvious to the audience and themselves that they're telling a story, whether they're seen in the movie or not. Character narrator or a non-character narrator. Books can mess with narrators. I've actually used multiple narrators in books. You can switch if the people say who they are talking. At any other time, it's a trick. How to switch multiple points of view. And really, in a book, you have to know that anyway, because if you're doing dialogue from shot, reverse shot style, like one person's talking to another, then the person that's talking has to be identified, and the person that he's talking to has to be identified, because you think, well, ontologically, we're not seeing these people right in front of us, so we don't know which character we're keeping track of in the movie practically, but in the book, we're like, well, they just said who it was, so I'm hanging on to that visual cue. They just said it was this guy in the novel, and now this is what he says, and he says certain pertinent information. And we're going to get going, though, here. I just had to clear up a little stock there, but on the telecine, you can really enjoy yourself with film stock and revive film stock and restart film stock and watch it through the telecine. It's kind of a small screen, but they save a lot of time in finding problems. You can catalog the problems real fast. But one thing we fret about is if the old canister of film is too dead, it might break up and break apart on a telecine, so it has to be judged for that in an archive. Now, speaking of movies and fun, I'd like to show you some of these titles that I'm finding on the internet and look at them, but I have a masterclass ordered for me to sanction for me to teach this from the front to you, so we can't, unless I move my computer and come smile next to it for some shot, I can't flip my phone around and show you what I'm looking at. But what you can do is go up to Google and type in capital D space W space Griffith, all capital, space filmography. Filmography is FILMOGRAPHY. Now, for those of you still not sure who Griffith is and are just joining the class now and may go back to look at pieces of it, we've had a real exciting time because we keep getting stuck on Birth of a Nation, Birth of a Nation. Well, the reason why is because it was counted as the film that went the most logically progressed to the sound era, even with classical Hollywood cinema, as any film should. It has the most film grammar that we've got copied down and used from any film. And by film grammar, we mean like a technique like we did back when we were talking about the assistant fireman, or the fireman, where he's crawling up the ladder, and then the next shot shows him crawling up on the other side, but there's either a gap or he's too close, so they cut it right on the line, and now it looks like one contiguous sweep up the ladder. And that's what I mean by building shots to match action, building shots to match shape, building shots to match eye line. All of these are in Birth of a Nation. The coded shots of metaphor are even destructive. I mean, you look at this one where they're like talking about how the Civil War is about to come on because of the slavery, right? But it was really the technological industry that was causing them to want to shut down slavery, although on the premise that the North actually fought the war because there were these giant, like, Mandingo, out of control experiments where African Americans were being hurt. I'd say that is one question to the war. Yes, the North seems to have had the Emancipation Proclamation. They seem to have wanted the slaves really out, and they seemed like the reason was because they were being abused. And as far as they were being abused, none of them during D.W.Griffith's era would ever admit to something so atrocious, but then they'd go right off with the Klan and shoot everyone in sight. And I don't really know enough about the Klan to say that you can be a member and still be non-political. I mean, sure, why not? They do that with Nazis. They do that with every kind of extremist group has a way of being in the group and then not becoming part of it. I mean, you look at that movie, The Conformist, and he's got to become a communist, but he's kind of interested in it. And then he finds out he is one, but then doesn't really get into the loop. And then he kind of falls apart trying to do his first job, and then his job falls apart. And it's the conformist. It means whatever anybody else is into, you're into too, is conformity. But this guy, every time, in The Conformist and Bertolucci's, every time he tries to conform, he's only conforming further and further to who he wants not to be. And that's like this consumer of, like, you know, capitalism, and just like goes off and has like a day with himself. But really, he wants to be a soldier for the Communist Army, and they're already telling him he has to or he'll die, and he still never quite finds the way in, even with a mission from somewhat underground headquarters. Now, this is a really interesting movie because it's also a gangster film, like Bertolucci. I mean, we all know he did Once Upon a Time in the USA. And I even got that wrong in an earlier masterclass last year where I was talking about Once Upon a Time in America. And it's done by Bertolucci. And Sergio Leone actually is who did it. Oh, I messed you up. But it's Bertolucci that does The Conformist. It's Bertolucci that does The Leopard. All right, there we go. Or wait, it's Visconti that does The Leopard. So see, I'm a little weak in memory, so I'm going to move on with the thing that's interesting about those films by all the filmmakers of the Italian New Wave is the Italian New Wave, or the Italian Neorealism as it's called, was really two bridges. It was like Vittorio De Sica and Rossellini in one camp, but Rossellini was the one that's kind of showing off to Pasolini, and then the other guys are kind of showing off to Fellini, who's really showing off to Leone. You know, the De Sica and the gang are showing off to Fellini, where they can be like where they have less money and they're still looking into really rich expeditions through the soul and the mind. And I've seen pictures in their mind that aren't anywhere else on a camera, yes. But the point of the story is I don't really understand how you couldn't see that Birth of a Nation had a big hand in the first 100 years of the cinema of America and the cinema worldwide, because really the same kind of plot gets used in Star Wars. It's this Iliad plot, right? The Iliad plot, we talked about that, where you're capturing the flag or guarding the flag, and there's several where they guard the flag, and there's several where they're capturing the flag. It's that old game we played as kids where some dude there's a flag at a base and everybody's guarding it, but then they've got to leave the base to go run and get their flag and bring it back. Now, and that's why I love this scene where the guy sticks the flag in bangs the flag into the open hole in the cannonball shooter, because it's capture the flag. He just totally got his flag back to their base and just kind of shoving it in and saying, "Don't shoot at us, we're all almost dead." I don't know how exactly they made him a war hero and took him to a war shop, but you have to remember that's kind of accurate, because in a weird way, the North and the South had this kind of glint in their eye that they're all fighting Americans and something's going wrong because they're killing like their own brothers. You know, as we see in True Heart Susie, a more accurate information where her brother gets killed, this dude's brother gets killed, so he marries his ex-wife and takes care of her like his brother asked him to do. And then they miraculously fall in love. I mean, this is melodrama, but it's melodrama in almost this comic way, it seems at first. And then like, no, that was a death. So melodrama deals with the sides of the conflict, the downsides of the conflict. Comedy deals with the conflict that is constant, that is either accidentally broken or just flows constantly over everything as the person thinks they're breaking the constancy. You have to break constancy in a comedy, because in a melodrama you can have, like, going back to the Italians, you look at Giovanni Pastrone, and even you go back further into the silent era, you know, Ruggiero that made Inferno. Ruggiero, I can't think of his name, but these guys in the early Italian era, which were making Italian sword and sandal epics, really got it right for what Birth of a Nation is really modeled after. But he really got it. If you look from Cabiria, for instance, Cabiria to Birth of a Nation, there's plenty to see that he's setting up a film like the way he thinks Griffith's going to make it, because they were actually competing at that time. And Birth was already in progress before Cabiria was done being made. But then Griffith saw Cabiria, and Birth of a Nation was pushed forward and basically became a sword and sandal epic, if it wasn't already, because those were around for a while, and those were some of the first films. Inferno was the one I was talking about, by Giuseppe Ruggiero. And it's like, you're already in a sword and sandal epic. Everybody looks like a realistic creature. They're realistic devils. It's like, has this already gone to Pasolini, where they're all ridiculous devils and dancing around? Or is this a Renaissance fair that just looks like really well-filmed cinema? Or are these more of those structures that we repeat, copycat, when we see it? Well, the film that throws all that off actually isn't exactly a Griffith film, because Griffith films seem like they're reenactable, don't they? I mean, like, you could supposedly we're reenacting these wars in the South, so we reenact it again so that the South wins, or whatever is your pleasure on that one. But the one movie that I know doesn't have any reenactments, or at least I don't think it does, is Doctor Strangelove. And yes, we talked about this in Masterclass, about how Doctor Strangelove has an ending so wild that although it could happen, it hasn't yet. This whole building right here would just, like, this film would just end, and then it would just, like, explode, and you'd see your own place explode, and you wouldn't even be able to watch all this if they watched Doctor Strangelove and really applied it to a copycat crime. That's the end of humanity. I mean, at least Kubrick set the boundary higher after Lolita. Like, I'm not a big Lolita fan because of how it's a young girl and an old guy, and that's kind of not my thing. I'm not a big fan of Clockwork Orange because some girls get hurt, and I didn't like that. I don't really like movies where girls get hurt in it. I know girls get parts in these Griffith movies where they get almost hurled over a cliff because they had to run away because they were being abused. Way Down East is lesser of a movie, I think, than Orphans of the Storm for that reason, although they torture the blind in Orphans of the Storm, the blind girl, and I find that reprehensible, I mean. Except that Griffith does that totally not accidentally and totally in his style, to show that the female can be completely under his spell, even though she's totally putting on an act and telling Griffith, act like you've put me under your spell, David, or whatever Lillian Gish would say. Lillian Gish had a long acting career, very long. She acted up to The Wedding with Robert Altman as one of Lillian Gish's last films, if not her last film. I know she'd been in a few others around that time, but it's 1971, about when Robert Altman's coming onto the scene. It's a brilliant movie, The Wedding. It's one of those ones that I'm sure old Criterion or somebody can dig up a copy of, and it's really nice. It's a nice film, and Lillian Gish, she's old in it, but she's really good in it. I mean, she makes a good character in it, and this kind of it's like this big wedding, and everybody's got something to say, and everybody's going with someone else every scene, you know. It's like they keep switching partners every scene, you know. And that does more tricks on sound, though. I just mentioned that Lillian Gish probably wouldn't have gone with Robert Altman had he not been a big D.W.Griffith fan. I think that's more proof that he had that Southern pride, Altman, but he also knew the Southerners could produce total butchers and mandingoists and all these things and make claims that the South was destroying itself and needed the North to come destroy it or whatever. But that Robert Altman has some down-home Southern goodness in him. He's not going the Griffith way of like, who's our biggest marketeers? Oh, well, I'll just give the money to them. Like the government, maybe? We'll see money shifting around to banks, and really Griffith's not doing too bad in the biograph area with his shorts. And we can read through some of this. I've got this D.W.Griffith filmography pulled up on Google, and it's like Birth of a Nation, Intolerance. We're talking about those right now. Broken Blossoms, Way Down East. You know, we've talked about those. Judith of Bethulia, 1914. I'd seen that as a 1913 clip, but let's talk about Judith of Bethulia. Now, the one thing that's interesting about the Babylon set in Intolerance is it was after the Judith of Bethulia lineup of the chariot race and all these things that are happening with her. And I think some of those characters are recurrent from Intolerance. I mean, in Intolerance. And they were maybe working on that scene when they decided to do the full mock-up before Birth of a Nation was done of the Babylon scene. That was supposed to be Intolerance. Then they had to over-budget it to get the rest of the story in, which was 3 other stories, which we have gone through. It's the story of Babylon, the fall of Babylon, the story of the fall of the French Empire, and the story of Jesus, which is totally mulled over and barely noticed, hopefully, and then the story, and the Jesus one should be mulled over, but it's a great nature documentary. They get some good rain cloud weather in that. But it's not like King of Kings with Cecil B. DeMille, where it's all this horror of Babylon stuff thrown at you, like excessively, like intentionally, that becomes campy and kitschy later. This Fall of Babylon with Griffith does have some moments of kitsch, but because it's silent, we're able to take it kind of as this old documentary of what Babylon falling would look like. And know that really film wasn't made when Babylon really fell. I don't think anyone really knew where Babylon was at the time, but maybe they had scholars that knew it was in the Middle East. I don't know. The Judith of Bethulia seems more specific, and it's got those the world Jews, those inglorious bastards, from all the way forward to the Tarantino film, who is a great director, and we're all going to be talking much more about him next semester, and you'll be all, I can already hear this in my Tarantino class next semester, you'll all be cheering for me, but mainly because I'm talking about the movies that we all grew up on and all wanted to see and all wanted to learn about in college. Well, these aren't the movies we grew up on, but we might need to see them just as a point of reference, not just for a nation, as a point of reference as where race was in 1915 as opposed to during the actual Civil War, which makes me wonder if it had been worse during the actual Civil War. It probably was, because every war movie you can count on the real event being worse. You just can, because they're still only feigning so much possibility with these war special effects. But these Hearts of the World guys are hard to forget, because they're the ones that like supposedly came back on Kill Hitler Day and flew in and got to him. And that makes me really weirded out to think that D.W.Griffith kind of stopped the Holocaust and stopped the war when he went back to fight it in World War II, already saying he would after the Chaplin and Griffith got together on The Greatest Dictator. And they were looking for, Griffith got out of jail he didn't go to jail quite yet, so he joined the war. He did get out of jail to go join the war. That's right. He'd been in jail a couple of years. Man, he went early. He went in like 1941. He's fighting the war in 42. Goes back to jail in 44. And still no other sound film was interesting to him. But this list, I'm going to try and read it all, but 1 million BC is attributed to D.W. Griffith. I've seen that attributed to him before, but all I've been able to find in the Quake is that Thank Your Lucky Stars and 1 million BC were somewhat credited to Griffith because he had some of the ideas as to how to make it, and they really wanted to give him those credits. But remember, even Ed Wood only got screenplay credit for Orgy of the Damned, and when he had Orgy of the Dead, his original screenplay, and it's really hard to transject what he would have done if he would have been the director of that movie but couldn't raise the funds, but yet he had such clout in Hollywood that he got to keep his credit on the script. And that's how everybody knows it's an Ed Wood script. Yeah. Griffith, on the other hand, with Birth of a Nation, we've all said he wrote it, he must have written it, and then memorized it and then burned it. Because he knew all his critics would come after him when he tried to make both sides equal. Of course, both sides don't end up being equal. The South gets predominantly destroyed and then wins in a predominantly Klan environment. It's like when the Klan comes back at the end, the South no longer frets that it will be in total chaos or disorder. Now, someone's going to make me say that Griffith's point of view was that there's all these free African Americans wandering around looking for a home or actually getting their 40 acres and a mule and all that. And would they really become chaotic, and would they riot, and would they overthrow the South again? And so that's why they did the segregation thing where blacks go one way, whites go the other, and everybody's no longer mixed. Well, that had been going around until the 40s. So really, the only breakthrough cutting edge we had in race, other than the women getting the vote, because that's all women, and they didn't question that, but like they didn't say only white women get the vote and that, but check this out. That racial implications were so bad until the Democrats came along in the 60s, after the blacklist, after House Un-American Activities, after they'd done everything else, and this is when Kennedy starts saying that segregation needs to leave, because we're always upsourcing the place we go, and then the segregated place isn't as good or doesn't have as much funding. This is a factor that Griffith may have overlooked, but he was always after in the movie business. Finding multiculturalism was one of Hollywood's first big goals. Even by Griffith, as he stated it with the Warner Brothers, was happy to be working with Hasidic Jews in Judith of Bethulia. And they would be a Zionist group that would fight wars mainly for the Jews and divide and conquer. Now later in the Griffith resource, you find that by the time he got to Germany the first time, which was after World War I, and he was still looking for different movies to make, right around the time of his movie, The Struggle, which was in 1940, and this one says Abraham Lincoln, 1930, excuse me. Abraham Lincoln was in 1930. The Struggle was in 1930. We know these movies to be like basically the end. Were they the destined, planned end? Well, this 1 million BC makes me think that Griffith may have done one of those Ed Wood things and wrote enough of the script to still get credit for it, because I read where it's uncredited of him to be on that movie, or it was too hard of a movie for him to make, or he didn't have the budget even though it was a low budget film, and inflation had caused, but he was still really high in the Directors Guild even when he was blacklisted. It was weird. I mean, I don't really think you get taken off the Directors Guild list once you're on it until the end of that director. I don't think it just goes right down. And I know a little bit about it. I'm like in their position low. For movies I make, like I just made a movie, and was I considering Griffith? A little bit. More was I considering French avant-garde. And in a way, French avant-garde is really one of the real building blocks of the language of cinema, along with Eisenstein, because it shows the edit at their cue, the way the edit cue is supposed to mix when there's an unmixed shot. And when you've got unmixed shots, a lot of times the avant-garde narration, even if it's match on shape, is your best bet for learning how to slam a montage together. The avant-garde cinema is going to teach you that just as... Now, Eisenstein, Podovkin, they've got it down to a science. They do shot-by-shot recreations of Intolerance, their own films, everything. They keep it in a big vault, and that's how they train cinema directors, is to become better through the vault. Now, we know things are not good, or our relations are not good with Russia, so I'll kind of rush through this, but there's this point where Russian cinema makes this beautiful comeback at the end of the 50s and later into the 60s and 70s, and that's with Andrei Tarkovsky. Now, Andrei Tarkovsky is kind of like a Griffith type because he does these wide angles of like long shots and like. But here in Tarkovsky it's quiet, no battles like Theo Angelopoulos, Leaky Meadow, the travel all contains within the shot. There's a lot of shots that will like be on a sudden. There's like this movie, The Mirror, and suddenly there's a crane for the camera, and there's no real obligation for there to be a crane other than it's damn artistic. And you see with Andrei Rublev, the movie by Andrei Tarkovsky about a painter who paints iconography for a church, and you see his black and white film. And black and white was the standard for all worldwide till about 1967, with Bonnie and Clyde being filmed in color. And Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was 1966, one of the last films to be in black and white, unless you're talking about all the films that intentionally pulled from color and went to black and white, like Schindler's List, Raging Bull, Dead Man, those kind of films. So black and white was ruled out. Silent films were never really brought back. Like Chaplin tried to write them out as much as he could and keep making silent films all the way to modern times, which is here we're in the 40s. With modern times, and with City Lights we're in the 30s. Modern times being 1936. Okay, I could maybe see that. And City Lights being 31, I could see that. And Great Dictators in sound. This is his first sound film, really, and it's been sound film for 10 years, since 1927. So we'll give him a little leeway, but they don't really do silent films anymore. Most people have trouble with silent films. I tried to make a couple of my own, and people like the avant-garde art ones that are like, whoa, we're staring at these images, and they should have sound, but they don't. Do they know they lost the soundtrack on that? I'm like, I cranked the soundtrack out of there. It took me a longer time to get the soundtrack out than to keep it in. There you go. But at this time, they didn't have sound match to picture. Now, they didn't know at the time that they were even going to need sound to picture, because they didn't know that cinema was going to survive. After Birth of a Nation, one thing that's so important about it is everyone had to keep a print of it in case it got banned, and now film survives. Film survives all the way to, yes, this Kino video version. And yes, this is a 3-hour and 8-minute version, but does that mean there wasn't a 4-hour version of Birth of a Nation? Because I'm not so sure. I read from the history books some different things, but it looks like he did go pro-German, D.W.Griffith, when he left the original time for Germany after World War I, and he was kind of helping rebuild Berlin, so it was only an irony that he'd go sack it again. But when he got out of jail, he always wanted to go to Germany. He did go to Germany for like a few days and shook some hands with some people that really, I don't know who they were, but somebody said it was controversial. And I wouldn't really doubt that there are controversial things that go on behind the scenes of movie making and behind the scenes of actors when it comes to politics with world leaders or superstars when it comes to management of an athlete or something. There's politics, there's psychology. You know, Griffith, D.W.Griffith, and Stanley Kubrick are basically the ones that are like, they're so powerful that psychologically they may be damaging. Like, they're so powerful at what they do that they're psychologically playing tricks. And like, isn't cinema itself, like perception of vision, persistence of vision and everything, kind of psychological anyway? Like, don't you have to bring your psychological baggage to anything you're looking at, let alone what you're watching? So you kind of do the Roger Ebert thing and get rid of your you know, psychological baggage, and then you're watching the film free of knowledge from what's going to happen in the film, etc. But to say they've never seen anything like this is truer, but then they've never heard anything like The Jazz Singer, except in some of those Alice Guy short films that were from France that had sound cinema in 1907, and they had no way of converting the theaters, and they had no way of converting all the film stock to that. Now, the sound process on film is a little different than what silent films had to be like on film. Most of the time, they're in classical aspect ratio. That's a 1-to-1 horizontal vertical stretch, because it's like a square, because the bright image is in one big square. But then they started realizing with Abel Gance and Napoleon in 1927 that they could extend it to 3 screens and shoot 3 screens at once and have 3 screens playing at once, the triptych back to back. And that's how they eventually built the Cinerama Dome. And the Cinerama film stock wasn't CinemaScope. That's a different one that's big. Cinerama was 3-to-1. CinemaScope was 2.85-to-1, almost as big as the Cinerama. The CinemaScope's the second biggest. Now they have the IMAX. And I don't think that I'm registering these films to be taught by IMAX as important as they are to be in the Library of Congress. Because they got to be in the Library of Congress, even though everyone's all offended by the racism. So you can't get rid of it. Earlier in this series, I'm like, yeah, let's just get rid of it if it's too much. But now I'm changing. I work for the Library of Congress. If you don't like a movie, send it to them. They'll shelve it. They'll keep it. They'll have an extra copy. They love it. They want everything. The Library of Congress supposedly has copies of all movies. And one reason you'd want them to have a copy of this is in case people needed to realize it was a real film later, and not just like some made-up pariah of like what we're throwing eggs at. Because somehow I get the feeling that when Obama mailed in that letter to the librarians last year, and I'm a librarian, and I got this letter from Obama that said, please don't ban books anymore. Don't ban them on the grounds of race. Don't ban Mark Twain on the grounds of racism. He says these books are racist. Keep them on in the shelves or hidden from the shelves, but in the library at least. The library can contain whatsoever information you need to research. And it don't mean you're coming at Birth of a Nation just like from a bad or good angle either, or like me from both. And really the only reason I see it as a bad angle is because it's not really telling us much about the aftermath of the war that any of us really know at all. Because who are we to say that it wasn't the South that was destroyed into wasteland, and when the slaves were gone, their economy was cut, and then they had to still build factories on their own dollar? So you get a few good Samaritans from the North coming down and lending a hand with the South, but like supposedly then the blacks are rioting? And if the blacks are rioting, then the Klan comes in? And now they've got segregation laws up until John F. Kennedy gets killed. And then that was his big thing to pass over, was no more segregation, and he was too dead, whether by gangsters, whether by anti-multiculturalists. I think it was the gangsters. Really, I'm not saying, because gangsters definitely aren't anti-multicultural, but multicultural organizations can get together and stir up trouble. But I'm going with the best bet was Griffith was thinking of the Klan in the Civil War, not in the Klan of today. When he found out it was the Clan of Today, he was already on the set of Intolerance, building it more and more, waiting for the big debut of Birth of the Nation, which, this is the irony. That movie almost took back as much as it cost to make, like $1 million. And by their money, that's like $1 billion or 10 billion to make that movie. No, it would have been more like $1 billion to make these movies now with all the things in it that they have in the film. But that's because these processes are harder to initiate upon the inflation of money. And the inflation is if I pay $1 ticket in Gone with the Wind in 1939, that's like $100 to go see Gone with the Wind in the IMAX per person or something, like they should do that. But stretching a one-on-one print to IMAX, I don't really know what that does, although the IMAX is kind of more square than rectangle compared to some of those streamlined Cinerama domes. They're like these big screens next to each other. There's a Cinerama dome in LA, I forget where the other one is, like New Jersey, but they're really beautiful things, and they really show that, like movies like How the West Was Won, which were shot by 3 cameras sitting back to back, had all taken in a picture, and how Abel Gance kind of taught us that if we can put same or different pictures in the other pictures, but still project it all as one shot. And then you really got deep focus long take, and you got Technicolor, and you've got stereophonic sound. In the first days of the sound film, not many made the transition. That's why we think Griffith kind of got beaten up at the transition, to Abraham Lincoln and the struggle. Most of his budgets were lost. Everything got wired for sound, and directing for sound is a differently used form than directing for silent film. Now, not today, though. Today, silent film and directing sound is almost the same, because when they redid that silent film, let's just say The Artist, I won Best Picture that one year. It was got that weird guy in it, and he's just like, it's a cool movie because it's silent film. They're remaking silent films, and I've been remaking silent films. And now here's this remake of a silent film that sweeps in and captures Best Picture and is in black and white, but looks like an Ernst Lubitsch kind of silent film to it. That's what they're kind of making with The Artist. And I thought, well, that had to be hard to do, but they had to have a sound crew, and they had to have it music made for the movie, and they were still filming it in different ways precisely because the audio track was coming up with while the video track was, not like when they first got sound and they had to sync the sound back with the image, which is hard to detect all the time in a jazz singer, because though Al Jolson's lips are moving to the words, sometimes the words are different word than where his lip moves, and being the first version of sync sound, they did a fantastic job in the jazz singer. Oh my gosh. For being the experiment, half of it's a silent film. And you can kind of see how they're directed different. One's with like this long take of this guy just singing it out. Blackface. And great. Now he's in blackface again. So now I got to spend 2 more lectures on why Al Jolson wore blackface. No, I'm kidding. We don't have to do that. But he's sitting there singing the song, and then he has to go through to the Hasidic side where he's with his Jewish friends again. And he's singing like these songs in his Jewish church, and then he goes back to the nightclub with the blackface. And then this is kind of a vaudeville trick anyway, and vaudeville kind of annoyed you kind of with its noise and overcoming, because they used the blackface and the Jewish act, but they had to be major stereotypes of themselves, not just because melodrama calls for stereotype, because it really doesn't if you look at True Heart Susie and some of D.W.Griffith's other excellent movies that are melodramas. So you don't always have to create that element of like everything's lost, or usually everything's lost, yeah. Or we're going to lose, now what, view in these kind of melodramatic films. But the stereotypes typically, from like the Sword and Sandal epics down to the romantic melodramas of D.W.Griffith, well, by the time you're there, most of the stereotypes have kind of fallen away, because now we're in the 20s. There's more theatrical practices that are coming up. The age of Shakespeare is still here, but the age of modern theater is coming upon us, and modern theater is really being restructured because of World War I And you can see how Griffith's movies are different after World War One. Some of them that he finished were still primitive and archaic in terms of how he was dealing with the concept of multiculturalism. And if this is his one flaw, I think I'm okay with having Birth of a Nation being my favorite film. Not because I'm sitting around saying, well, you know, I don't want there to be any space for there to be a movie about anything, you know, because some movies where if people get killed in the movie, not because of the movie, but in the movie, then I'm a little against it if they still show it. But nobody ever names that example because they said that film would be banned, right? Even when Will Rogers gets buckshotted by John Ford and blown up. In Will Rogers, we don't know for sure what just happened, and we have to be told by the film experts, like a friend of mine once told me about. And it's kind of like the chain game of phone games where you test a person's critical ability and reliability. And if they told you a story about D.W.Griffith you hadn't heard before, you can check it back with like the Griffith book, the Schickel book. The movies usually have documentaries. This particular version has documentaries. But the main reason of holding on to these movies, at least getting a copy to the Library of Congress, is because one day there may not be movies anymore, folks. So we need a record of every movie ever made. Now, if someone else wants to do the porn archive, that's in somebody else's hands. Every movie ever made. I don't really object to porn anymore, but I don't use it, you know. But if you want to make that archive, you can go your own way. But if you want to make a narrative film or an exclusive documentary or like a non-narrative documentary, which is an avant-garde poetry film, you can do all that. Hell, where's the better place to go than film school than to make an avant-garde film, learning from the avant-garde films how to make a big movie? And it's funny because those came out usually a little bit after a movie like this, because a movie like this had to come out to set everybody's pants on fire in the world as to what we should do to either reject the American narrative style that's becoming so frequent in all the films everywhere and has adapted to frequently other countries, all the films everywhere becoming to look like American, is because the Americans are having the biggest box office bonanza, which never catches them up to paying back this kind of a film, just like in today's Hollywood too, right? We spend so much on the film that we have to make $1 billion back, and then when we're $1 short, go on to the next one and we take out a freaking loan because we're going to. And that's what he did with Intolerance. Griffith took out a loan. I mean, he just. Yeah, so let's read a couple more of these titles and then I'm going to let you go early, class. We seem to have had fun this time and we really barely got into it. Now, don't forget, The Adventures of Dolly, 1908, was one of his first films that was a biograph short later after he left the films of Thomas Edison. Now, The Lone-Dell Operator is one of those Grand Guignol films who's on the phone type thing, and Griffith did do, it looks like, a kind of French mock-up of that in 1911. So it would have been a biographic short. So let's skip In Old California. There's a short for you. That one kind of reminds me of the idea of like the backwards Grape of Wrath, where they just all get along and they all enjoy California. You know, it's a short film, 5 minutes. The Sorrows of Satan. That one we need to cover real quick. So I'm going to cover this. Oh, we're getting limited to what we can cover here. The Sorrows of Satan, it's funny because if you look back at The Avenging Conscience, which is actually really the first feature film of the Americas, except for From Manger to the Cross and that Oliver movie, and Judith of Bethulia was supposedly that year too, but the Avenging Conscience is an hour and 30 minutes, which most films in the era of modernism and classicism ran about an hour and a half, or in modern lengths, times were longer and they ran 3 minutes. Now in the postmodern era, you can have everything from 3 seconds to 15 days of film just shot across, you know. The Avenging Conscience is Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, Faust. Sorrows of Satan is Faust, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. It's a very similar movie, and they've reused some of the things in that. But The Sorrows of Satan is a really tricky movie because it has 2 plots, one that's not a horror film and one that is, and The Avenging Conscience kind of has that too, but As far as their remakes of each other, I would draw the line if someone really told me they were remakes of each other, because The Sorrows of Satan has a lot more things to do with effects and scariness, and I keep trying to dial it up, and then I'm getting the connection line. So here, while I try to do that, we're running out of time, and I can just, for some reason, if I reload this site, maybe reload this site and give it one more chance. Thank you for sticking with me, class. Don't leave yet. Oh, nope. We're getting a low use of the connection. We're getting a not secure on this. So we're going to have to call it quits. And anyway, we're right here at the end of class. So my computer's glitching out right at the end. So that makes sense. And maybe that's what happened to Griffith. He put all those script pages into his head and was reading all his head. And then he's like, wait, now I will show you what it's going to look like. And then his film fell apart and exploded. And somebody shot at it like a Tin Pan Alley. And he had to just memorize the script he'd already thrown away and go out and film it. Well, the only good to come out from being so controversial is now you have to save a copy forever if you're a Library of Congress. Not if you found the uncopyrighted version on Amazon. And don't blame me or send me any copies like that. They have worse imagery than Birth does, which has mainly not so much bad imagery, but bad imposition of power over people, over one or the other, based on they're cruel and evil if they're of a different race, and they're fine and sophisticated if they're white or whatever. I could never really find that in any of the real stories of the Civil War. It just seemed like an over exaggerated, the Southern style still wins the war. And if that's the way you plan on choosing your adventure, then God be with you. I don't really believe in God in that way, though, because D.W.Griffith kind of makes more sense to me to believe in than a God. And some people would be like, well, get rid of this guy. He doesn't teach about who we like. And that's just because you were all trained to dislike D.W.Griffith. But more on that later. Because in the 70s, every director was against him. The multiculturalists had arisen and said that Kennedy wouldn't have died unless Kennedy died because of him. The segregation laws was the aftermath of the Civil War. And the Harlem Renaissance barely saved the day. Well, there were movies in 1919 called Within Our Gates that barely saved the day, too. So I don't really know why the anti-Griffith thing got off so big, except the history books hadn't really been fixed yet. Now we can all kind of look back and say, oh, he did liberate Dachau, so as anti-Jew as he got in Germany. Well, that all got cleverly taken care of later on down the road. And I'll see you all later on down the road.